Spy Cops Info Podcast. Looking at Britain's secret undercover political police who infiltrated campaign and activist groups. Episode 3. SDS Officer HN345. Alias Peter Fredericks. Deployed in 1971 only.
So, hello and welcome to the Spy Cops Info Podcast. I'm Penny.
I'm Chris.
So welcome. So today we're going to talk about Peter Fredericks. Chris, can you tell us just a bit about Peter Fredericks?
Yeah, for sure. Well, what we know about him is basically his police career. When he joined the Metropolitan Police in the mid-1960s. We think I'm kind of surmised that he started off somewhere in West London, maybe Notting Hill area. There's a couple of little clues for that. But anyway, yes, he started up as a normal uniform PC. And then at some point after that, he was asked by a senior officer if he'd be interested in doing some kind of undercover work, which he agreed to. And that's described it's kind of glossed over the actual words that he used, but it's basically described as street crime work. So I'm guessing kind of dealing with maybe fencing of stolen goods, low-level drug dealing, maybe sex work as well. Though it's not, none of those, is not specified.
Okay, so he's done bits and pieces, and he's done that kind of undercover work. And then how did things change where he sort of changed his focus?
Well, it came out of that street crime work. Somewhere along the way, he picked up little bits of information regarding campaigning stuff, specifically anti-apartheid campaigning, and also Black Power stuff as well, which he just happened to come across, which is one of the things maybe it makes me think it was in the Notting Hill, Ladbroke Grove area of London, because there was lots of stuff going on around there at the time. It was very much like a radical bit of London, lots of squatting and other campaigning. VSC, the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, of course, had a very big branch there, alongside other stuff, as well as famously, of course, the Mangrove 9 will go on briefly to talk about in a bit as well.
Okay, cool. So he did lots of that kind of stuff. And then how did he move focus? I guess, how did he get to be working more on sort of, what came to be known as the SDS, the Special Demonstration Squad? That's
right. Well, he moved then from uniform to special branch, obviously within the Metropolitan Police. So with special, it seems that he got tapped up by special branch, so to speak, because of these tidbits of information he picked up about the anti-apartheid campaigning, the anti-apartheid movement. And according to him, at least, he received for this a commendation from MI5, from the security services. As he said himself, Fredericks, when he was giving evidence at the hearings in November, there appears to be no record of that.
Now, when you talk about records of stuff that he's done or says he's done, or says like commendations he said he's received and things like that, like there's very few like sort of formal records of this stuff. So how reliable is that?
Well, I mean, there's some stuff so in both his written statement and also when he gave his live evidence, he refers to his career, record of career at the Met, but we're not privy to that. That document has not been published, so we're going by his word, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just his word. There's no other corroboration.
And that issue is exacerbated by this officer, because there's only actually 2 reports from his period with the Special Demonstration Squad that they actually found, and also that were published. But maybe actually going one step backwards. So prior to within Special Branch, he seemed he first joined C Squad. Now C Squad, basically they monitored political campaigners specifically, or at least as he describes, in the Trotskyist and anarchist areas. And they did, I suppose, they covered the same areas of the SDS, but rather than having a deep undercover persona, they did, I guess, what you'd call standard plainclothes work. So they would turn up to random political meetings and report on them. So I guess there may have been some kind of subterfuge required, in the sense that obviously they didn't announce themselves as police officers, although they probably would have been thrown out of the meeting, but they didn't have an undercover persona as such. Though it seems actually, Fredericks, but when asked about his SDS, his undercover persona, Peter Fredericks, he seemed to suggest that he'd already developed some kind of basic story whilst he was doing his street crime work, and I think he hints at actually that his cover name for the SDS was actually created during this work.
And what about his like appearance? Because we know they all go through like these like appearance changeover, like opposites of makeovers or whatever, as I would describe. That's right. Maybe.
Yeah, it might have been that he had this kind of appearance before, at least to some extent, when he was doing his street crime work. But he describes himself definitely when he's with the SDS as having a Che Guevara moustache, for instance.
Okay, nice. Just some of the descriptions from him from court, like some of his mannerisms when he speaks sounded a bit odd. Like apparently he liked to stick out his tongue a bit and things. Or sorry, during the hearing. And so I'm trying to picture that. But yeah, a bit funny. And so which groups was he sort of really focusing on?
So I think it would be hard to say what his focus would have been had he done the normal, if you like, the standard 4-year deployment. So I guess you could say the other officers who've been give testimony, they describe as it takes quite a long time to get going, to get into the groups. When he was doing C Squad stuff, I wanted to talk about one of his reports. So I said there was only 2 SDS reports with his name on published, but there was actually 5 in total, and 3 of those were special branch reports, but before he went undercover with the SDS. And there was one of those which is, I guess, of some interest, because it gives a bit of a background to what kind of things you get in a normal special branch report. Mm-hmm. And this was a report. His name is on, though I don't think he actually wrote it. It's a special branch report when he was with C Squad, which is on the Socialist Labour League, which was a Trotskyist group, which would become, more like to have heard of this, the Workers' Revolutionary Party in 1973. And it's interesting. It's a 14-page long report on this conference, which was actually held at Ali Pali in London. And it's 14 pages, but that includes like 5 or 6 pages of lists of names of all the attendees of the conference, and then not only that, but it also lists also the car registrations and models, which the latter of which is generally speaking not on special demonstration squad reports. But the reason I mention that is because that Fredericks later on, when he's asked what's the difference between normal special branch reporting and SDS reporting, and what he says is that normal special branch reports were a bit more selective in terms of what they reported, whereas SDS reports reported absolutely everything. Now, perhaps that is the case in general, but this report isn't a particularly good example of it, because not only does it have all these names and car registrations and models, but it also mentions, for instance, that there was a pop group called Porcelain Frog and the Skull entertained the attendees. Now, if that isn't a bit of useless information in terms of what the special branch are mainly concerned with, I don't know what is. By the way, I've already looked up Porcelain Frog and the Skull on the internet, and there is sadly no trace of them.
Oh, that's disappointing. But also, I mean, like how to, like, you know, that's, I don't know, like spending that much time getting all the car registration numbers, like how to like do that without standing out like a sore thumb.
And so this report is written by another special branch officer, so it's unclear whether he and or Fredericks stood in the car park listing all the registration number plates themselves, which you would have thought would have been a little bit conspicuous. There was other officers doing that. So I mean, at this conference is relatively big, according to the report. It's like 2,000 attendees there. So, you know, as well as the band Porcelain Frog and the Skull, just giving them another mention there.
Do you think they draw straws to see who gets to listen to the band and who gets to get the car registration numbers?
Yeah, well, yeah, who knows?
I mean, depends. They could be a really good band. Who knows? Okay, so that's his report on that one. Any more about reports?
Well, I was going to mention that was the one report out of the three I was going to talk about pre-SDS. But perhaps we'll go maybe talk about his brief career in the special demonstration squad now.
Yeah, okay, so that's good. So Special Demonstration Squad, the whole podcast talks a lot about Special Demonstration Squad. He had such a short time in it, really, but he was involved, I think, in three, like, sort of a couple main areas. Can you tell us which groups he was involved in?
Well, the reports, there's only two reports, and they're both on a group called the Black Defence Committee, and they were a solidarity group formed from another Trotskyist group. They were the Spartacus Youth, and they were the youth group of a slightly more famous Trotskyist group called the International Marxist Group. Tariq Ali, of course, was a leading member of that, who gave evidence at the. He was one of the first civilian witnesses at the undercover policing inquiry, of course. And yeah, they were a solidarity group, and they formed after the Mangrove restaurant protest, where lots of people got arrested, but 9 people went on trial, which of course was recently a really good film made by Steve McQueen, which was televised on iPlayer recently, still on there as far as I know. So I won't talk too much about that because there's a lot of information out there. But yes,
say if we have listeners from like other places, just a brief summary of that. Was that part of a campaign of harassment and sort of what some people now currently choose to deny about the systematic discrimination against people of colour?
So the Mangrove was a restaurant in Ladbroke Grove rather than Notting Hill. I might be wrong on that. My West London geography is not the best, but it was run by a guy called Frank Critchlow. It was very much like a place which welcomed the predominantly Caribbean migrants there who got less than a friendly welcome at other places in the area. I mean, it was continuously, it was harassed by the police, which is why the protest happened. And then there was the famous Mangrove 9 trial.
And the police obviously didn't do a very good job during that time period at all.
Well, it depends what you mean a good job. I mean, they harassed the restaurant out of business eventually. So in that sense, from their perspective, I guess if that's what they wanted to do, it was a good job.
Yeah, not good for, normal people.
No.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, and so what was his infiltration?
Well, I mean, it was the two reports are quite standard. They're sort of public meetings, and there's a reasonable number of people at them. One of the people who addressed, we're talking September 1971. Both these reports date to, and one of the meetings was addressed by a man called Carl Brecker. He was a black South African student, and he, unsurprisingly, talks about the South African apartheid regime. And I just wanted to talk about Carl Brecker recently a little bit more, because he stayed in the UK until around 1980, at which point he applied for British citizenship, and he was refused by the then Home Secretary for undisclosed reasons. So, obviously we don't know this, but one of the things we do know about undercover policing and the effects it had at the time, I guess invisible at the time and visible now, was about the blacklisting campaign. So people who were spied on trade union activists. Some of the information that undercover officers fed back to Special Branch and then fed back to the private or the sort of blacklisting agency, I should say, the Consulting Association, and that affected people's careers and jobs and whole lives because they couldn't get work because of that. Mm-hmm. Reading about Carl Brecker, you kind of realise it. Obviously, trade unionists is one category of people, but what about people who didn't have British citizenship but wanted to exercise their rights to protest, etc., and they got caught up in this? And this guy, Carl Brecker, as far as I'm aware, he didn't have any kind of criminal record or anything. So it does lead us to wonder maybe the whole reason why he got refused citizenship was simply because he had a Special Branch file opened up on him.
Yeah, we don't know, do we? But it is definitely questionable given the historic precedent.
And the fact that the reason why he was refused was undisclosed to him does lend itself to that, because that would, this kind of information is classified, and so they can simply refuse to say why. because of that. So yeah.
And I think that in many ways seems problematic, because I think one of the things that's really clear in everything that comes out is that if just the way they're sort of willing to reduce your rights as a person, as if you're if an activist even, which is like, ridiculous. And then on top of that, if you are then in this kind of situation, they just have so much more power as well on top of you. So that's
Exactly. And as I say, I guess despite all the shortcomings of the inquiry, at least this has bring stuff more into light, and these kind of details are one of thousands that we'll hear about.
One of the campaigns that we knew he was involved in sort of infiltrating was Operation Omega. Can you tell us, what that was involved with?
Yeah, so this is around 1970, so it's around the time that what became Bangladesh and what was called then East Pakistan had an independent struggle and broke away from Pakistan. So an Operation Omega appeared to be some kind of humanitarian organisation that campaigned around that issue.
He spent such a short time undercover with that group, but he wasn't massive. He wasn't involved in the hierarchy of the group, so to say. But what information was he gaining? What was he?
We're not really sure what information he gained, because there's no extant special branch reports. It does seem though that he came across an activist from one of these campaign groups surrounding the Bangladesh independence struggle, and when he was a C branch officer, and he managed to inveigle his way into the group, or get to know a particular person that he met on a demonstration, a woman.
Okay, and so he spent some time getting to know this woman?
That's right, yeah. So it's sometimes it's hard to say which person they're talking about. The reason for this is that all the names are redacted, so I assume this is the same person we're talking about throughout. So this woman he describes as very intelligent and a journalist. And he goes out, perhaps you might say controversially, by himself with her to a restaurant, and he's actually asked about this in the inquiry, about whether there was any romantic sexual factor in this relationship, which he unsurprisingly denied.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but so he had dinner with this woman, he found her really interesting. Anything else happen? Yeah,
well then he goes on to say that maybe he suspected that she wasn't all that she seemed, and it's hinted at. It's hinted at. He doesn't actually say it in so many words that perhaps he describes her as being from the United States, and together I think he leads us to conclude ourselves that perhaps she was some kind of CIA operative.
Okay, so he had that contact, that interaction and things, but he was never sort of very high up, but he informed on this group and things a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and as he describes himself, it was like a humanitarian group, so obviously not even a political group.
So what would be the purpose of that kind of information? That's a completely legitimate thing to do if there's humanitarian issues.
Yeah, well, it seemed like there was some interest from the MI5 to find out information about this, which may certainly, obviously we don't know the CIA. This woman was from the CIA. Let's say that, but we do know at the time, having done a little bit of digging on it, the CIA were very much interested in finding out what was going on in that region for geopolitical reasons. The Cold War, obviously, on, so every place in the world was a potential battleground, for West versus East, etc. So, and they certainly had an interest in that particular conflict.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the CIA have a long and well-documented, unlike him, but a well-documented history of involvement and these kinds of things around the world. So. Yeah,
of course. Just a few. In the early 70s, there was the Frank Church Committee, which investigated the CIA, of the world, but obviously, so certainly it's not. Although there's not too much evidence for us to definitely conclude that Peter Fredericks was going out for dinner with a CIA agent. There is, I think, it is plausible on the level as there probably were CIA agents in London at the time interested in Bangladesh.
Yeah, it's almost like if she was a CIA agent, what would she have gained from having dinner with him? I don't know.
Yeah, well, maybe she realised that he was. I mean, who knows? I mean, it gets a bit like like a spy novel. It was late '60s, so spy. That's when the classic spy novels, of course, were written. So, yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay. Good. So, any other reports or things?
Although his two special demonstration squads reports were specifically on the Black Defence Committee, in his written statement and his oral testimony, he does suggest that he perhaps was involved with other groups which doesn't quite sound like an organised Trotskyist group. So I was going to quote a little bit here. This is from his statement. It says, "My main link with such groups, Black Power groups that is, was through a man who supported the US Black Power movement. I do not know if he ever went to the US. He worked with figures from the Black Power movement in the UK. I got the impression that the intention was to unite the Black Power movements in Britain and the US, although the US movement was wealthier and more established." This is, I'm quoting from him. And he mentions that he would go to Speaker's Corner every Sunday. Now, we do know that the leading lights of the British Black Power movement regularly went to Speaker's Corner every Sunday. And he goes on to suggest that after Speaker's Corner, he would go for a tea or coffee just round the corner at a coffee shop in Marble Arch, very close to where the Amber Hotel is, of course. Where the inquiry is being live streamed to this next week. And he says, "I never got to know these others well, but I wanted to develop the relationship. There were certain groups in society who wished to advance their objectives." So, and he also mentions hanging out in Notting Hill Gate, Portobello area, and go to private meetings in houses and pubs. And he said he would play pool and cultivate relations that way. And it seems a lot more casual, just hanging around than going to an organised meeting. But I did a little bit of research around there and asked a few people who are more knowledgeable in British Black Power movement. None of the groups seemed to fit from what he was saying, really. So it's a bit of a mystery, really. I mean, to be fair, this was 50 years ago, so maybe I think, give him a bit of a break in the sense that it was a long time ago. So yeah, it's unclear, but it is obviously of interest, especially given people's desire to hear about the history of the British Black Power movement, whether there was an infiltrator at that stage.
Mm-hmm. So basically, he spent time hanging out with people and going to some meetings.
Yeah, he describes himself, not in these words, not very as such, very much a people person, someone who could get on with people very well. That was his. He again, I'm not using his own words. He definitely was very confident of himself, and he. There's a later undercover who got the nickname James Blonde, but this guy, Peter Fredericks, very much fancied himself, I think, as some kind of master spy. I think it would be fair to say.
Yeah, it sounds like it, definitely. Great. And so in terms of so he sounded like he's got a bit of just very unguided time and things, almost like lots of spare time on his hands, almost. So what was his sort of supervision, guidance and training like for all of this?
He described it, as other officers do at that time, as very much like a hands-off approach. They received no formal training whatsoever, really, and sort of very little ethical guidance. Mm-hmm. So you would have said probably going out to dinner with somebody by yourself probably wouldn't have, would have been out of the question, but that's what he did.
So I think one of the things, his, I guess his judgment sometimes seems a little bit not 100%, especially looking at it nowadays from a lens that's more informed, especially around sort of some of the abuse of women that's happened because of these undercovers. There was one incident where I think he went back to a woman's flat 3 years after being not undercover anymore.
Well, it was actually after he left the Met completely, and that we know is after the mid-70s, so it would have been at least three or 4 years after he was deployed as an SDS officer. And yeah, he said he happened to be in the area and he popped round to her flat, which seems a bit odd. So as it turned out, she wasn't there. In fact, as he was informed by someone who was living there, who's, again, because the individual's name's redacted, so it sounds like the person who answered was either a relative or a friend of this woman. And he was informed by her that she had in fact committed suicide, sadly. But I mean, again, he was questioned at the inquiry whether this relationship was a closer one that he was letting, or was it romantic? And again, of course, he denied that. But it just seems very, given it was a relationship he had with somebody whilst he was in his undercover persona, 3 years at least, 3 to 4 years previous, just seems a very odd thing to do, even as he said, on a whim.
I was trying to think about this a bit because I remember, time before mobile phones and time before internet, time with phone books and things, like massive phone books for everybody. Is that something you might have done more in that era? I don't know. It still seems creepy to me.
It does. I mean, if you had a longer and a deeper friendship with somebody, it does seem, it would seem probably relatively normal. But he didn't, his relationship with this woman was purely based on deception, that he was an undercover officer. It wasn't like she was a mate of his.
No, and he was undercover for, not even a full year. How well did he get to know somebody if he was mostly sort of socializing in groups and spending a lot of time playing pool?
Exactly, yeah. A comment he made, because he was asked about sexual relationships, whether he was aware of that at the time, which he said no, as all the officers from this sort of early phase, 1968, 71, none of them admitted to any knowledge whatsoever, of course. But he made a comment that when he heard about some officers, some SDS officers and later officers had been in sexual relationships, he made a comment that, as with a drugs undercover officer, it's not unreasonable for officers to sample the products.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a horribly callous thing to say. I'm not really sure how much I need to say about that, really. But there's also another element to it, but obviously because we know that he was as he put it, a street crime undercover officer previously, which would have lightly dealt with drugs. So maybe he was referring to himself sampling the products, literally. So we obviously don't know that, but I suppose he seemed to have a lack of boundaries. I think is what we can surmise from all of that.
Yeah, I think lack of boundaries is fair to say, with a penchant for a little bit of sexism thrown in, I think is a fair enough assessment. And so how did all this stuff come to an end?
Yeah, so there's two versions, it seems to be. I mean, we only have Fredericks telling of both, but he kind of gives what he perceives to be the official version, which is on file, and what he was told in confidence. So according to his Met career report, which obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have access to, he was asked to leave the SDS for a couple of reasons. One, that he wasn't very good at report writing, and secondly, he compromised another undercover officer who was on close observation duties. So that's what he makes out is the pretext for his removal from the SDS. But he gives another more, I suppose you could say, interesting explanation. What he says is that one of his job referees that he used to join Special Branch, as it turned out, was a Soviet double agent.
Sorry. Marshall.
I mean, he did say that on oath, so to some extent, we can't definitely say that's rubbish, because actually, when he was on giving evidence, he did slightly make it as a maybe that was the case rather than that was definitely the case. But according to him, his his senior officer told him that as much.
So his senior officer told him that his job referee could have been a Soviet double agent. Okay, nod, nod, wink, wink kind of thing. And that's kind of what he then went on to say. So he was a little bit non-committal to that, or...
Yeah, I mean, if we examine that, obviously we have no proof either way, or whether that happened or not. One of the things that would be strange, though, if it was a security issue, it seems strange that he was allowed to carry on in special branch in another role for another couple of years at least. So, I mean, obviously, Special Branch, they did other things. So, for instance, they've done close protection, bodyguarding, and they also vetted people at ports as well. So, I guess they're not unsensitive areas, and all Special Branches officers would have had access to confidential, classified information in that sense. So, if he was a security risk, then why was he allowed to carry on serving in Special Branch?
But this is something he has said under oath, so he has, so that's interesting, because that, he's a former police officer, he takes oaths very seriously, I presume, so that's a significant thing to say under oath, I believe. And if he thinks it enough to say it under oath, then that is interesting, and probably a far more interesting life than mine. Really.
Yeah, I mean, he was pretty in his... These are questions that he answered in his witness statement, and to some extent, as I say, in his testimony. And these were, if you like, voluntary answers, because all the former undercovers, they're given a set of questions by the inquiry to answer. So he didn't really probably need to go into such detail in this, and he seems... I mean, in his statement, he makes clear that he was very unhappy about being removed from the SDS.
Okay. And from a more practical point of view, if we were being looking back at his working career history, his report writing skills weren't very good, so he wasn't great at that. I
mean, in some ways, that does seem an odd thing to be removed from the SDS, to be on in balance. This is because although a lot of the SDS officers give different accounts of how the reports were created. So, for instance, Doug Edwards, who we talked about in episode 1, he very much suggested that the reports were a joint effort. That the undercovers supplied some of the information, but they were in fact typed up and amended by other officers in the back office, etc. So, I guess to that extent, maybe it does seem a bit odd he was removed because of his. Report writing skills or lack of them.
Because he was quite clear, despite the fact that we have so few of his reports, he wrote several reports a week, and I think he said he wrote them and somebody else typed them up and somebody else would choose what was important from that. So that sort of implies, again, there was that joint effort to it. So his personality came out as being a bit of a, larger than life, or at least believing his life was larger than life kind of...
I suppose, given that we're talking about quite a short period within Special Branch, let alone the SDS, he does seem quite incident-filled. We've got a CIA agent and a Russian double agent.
And none of the other people so far have said they've had these kinds of contacts?
Certainly not with the CIA, no.
Okay, so again...
Obviously, as we know now from what's been said, that there is quite a lot of MI5 involvement with the SDS, which we're going to hear about more in phase 2 when it starts this week, as we're speaking now.
Good. Okay. Fabulous. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered everything.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks for your time today, Chris.
Thank you.
For more information on this topic, please visit spycops.info, where you can subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, join our Facebook group, and a lot more. We're grateful to the Campaign Opposing Police Surveillance for their financial support in allowing us to buy microphones. Hopefully we'll improve more. If you'd like to support the podcast, please get in touch.